Please note, today's podcast was recorded before Putin's official rejection of the ceasefire proposal put forward by the United States. Putin has claimed to have agreed in principle to a 30-day ceasefire, but not according to the terms put forward. We assumed this would be the case, and so today's recording you're about to hear is still very much topical. I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Russia looks set to reject a ceasefire, we discuss the Kremlin's objectives, including in Kursk, and what they mean for the next phase of talks with the United States. Then we hear from the major defence summit in Paris and what Europe's plans are for Ukrainian security guarantees. Then we discuss the wider strategic picture as it evolves at this critical moment in European history.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 13th of March, 3 years and 18 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor for Defence, Dominic Nicholls, just fresh off the train from Paris, and Phillips O'Brien, Professor in Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews. First though, I summarise the major military and political developments of the past 24 hours. At the time of recording, Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, has touched down in Moscow for crunch talks, though Russia has seemingly rejected the 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine proposed by the US. Yuri Ushakov, Putin's foreign policy advisor, says it would be nothing other than a temporary breather for Ukrainian troops, saying that Moscow wants to discuss a long-term settlement, not a temporary pause. Whether this position is cast iron or merely an attempt to show defiance before conversations later in an attempt to get more concessions remains to be seen. Putin will reportedly make a statement later alongside Belarusian President Lukashenko, who's visiting Moscow, a key Russian ally, of course. Now, as discussed in detail in yesterday's episode, there are advantages and disadvantages for the Kremlin in accepting or rejecting the ceasefire proposal. As Russia expert Professor Mark Galeotti has emphasised today, Putin wants Kursk entirely recaptured first. More on that shortly, because if there is any chance the ceasefire front line ends up freezing as a de facto border, he cannot leave any Russian territory in Ukrainian hands. Mark also underscores that Putin doesn't take tough decisions quickly and may be waiting to gauge the response from the public and key sectors of the elite before giving a definitive answer, as well as wanting to try and layer more demands onto any ceasefire. Interestingly, the Washington Post has published a secret document obtained by a European intelligence service written in February, produced by an influential Moscow-based think tank close to Russia's FSB. That document argues the Kremlin should work to weaken the US negotiating position on Ukraine by stoking tensions between the Trump administration and other countries while pushing ahead with its efforts to dismantle the Ukrainian state. It dismissed Trump's preliminary plans for a peace deal within 100 days as impossible to realise, and said that a peaceful resolution of the Ukraine crisis cannot happen before 2026. The document also rejects any plan to dispatch peacekeepers to Ukraine, as some in Europe have proposed, more on that later, and insists on recognition of Russia's sovereignty over the Ukrainian territories it has seized. It also calls for a further carve-up through the creation of a buffer zone in Ukraine's northeast on the border with Russian regions such as Bryansk and Belgorod, as well as a demilitarised zone in southern Ukraine near Crimea. Now, if this document is representative of the Russian position, then whatever happens next, it would show no major movement by Moscow in terms of its maximalist objectives. It is worth remembering that Washington has already given multiple concessions. The idea of Ukrainian land being ceded, no Ukrainian membership in NATO, no US peacekeepers, etc., with very little, if anything, being given in return in terms of concessions by Moscow. There are also reports that through back channels with Western officials, some experts have promoted a scenario in which Ukraine becomes a big Austria with a constitutional guarantee of neutrality. As a reminder, Austria's neutrality is rooted in the Austrian State Treaty of 1955 and the declaration that followed, the price of its sovereignty being restored after occupation by the Allies post-Second World War. Now, as part of that, there are no foreign troops or military bases allowed on Austrian soil, though it is a member of the EU and cooperates with NATO. It seems to me, though, and many others, that would still leave Ukraine exposed to Russian interference, just as Austria historically has been, as well as leaving it naked if there were a future invasion in several years' time. I imagine that many Europeans would not be content with that as a lasting solution. If Moscow is set on pursuing obstinacy and delay, that could put it on a collision course with Trump, who threatened yesterday to devastate the Russian economy if the Kremlin does not sign a ceasefire deal. He said we could do things very bad for Russia, would be devastating for Russia, but I don't want to do that because I want to see peace. That would see us back on one of the paths we discussed all the way back in December. We said then, and I quote, "The best case scenario is that if Russia refuses to negotiate seriously, the narrative may shift, exposing Moscow, not Kyiv, as the primary obstacle to peace. That could be the moment Washington decides to double down on supporting Ukraine, strengthening its leverage on the battlefield and potentially compelling Moscow to negotiate in earnest. But this is the most optimistic scenario, and even it entails a longer, bloodier war. This is why it has proven so disastrous for Europe not to demonstrate its capacity, both in moral terms and military terms, to support Ukraine not only to fight, potentially to win decisively." However, as we discussed in yesterday's podcast, the idea that when push comes to shove, this White House would back Ukraine over Russia seems highly unlikely. To quote Professor Elliot Cohen, "Any European leader who believes any promise that comes out of the mouth of a Trump administration official is a fool. For 4 years at least, you are in grave danger because you simply cannot trust us." Now, the Telegraph's foreign correspondent Memphis Barker has written an excellent piece today, which we'll link to in the show notes, where he underscores that it's more likely Trump would ultimately make offers to Putin rather than threats to secure a ceasefire. As he says, for Putin, a pause in fighting would be a relatively small pill to swallow in return for normalisation of relations with the US and the fulfilment of his opposition to NATO proximity. To push him in that direction, it is possible to imagine Trump presenting the Russian leader with a full list of potential joint diplomatic and economic projects. The US would frame its willingness to lift sanctions on Russian energy, a key Putin demand, in line with this 30-day ceasefire. Stop fighting, and we could start talking immediately about relief, Trump could say. He could also offer to turn off weapons support to Ukraine. That last point is interesting because just on that, according to a US official, Ukraine has run out of ATACMS now. Trump could say to Putin he would not deliver any more if he does what he wants. Now, since we're on to the military realm, in a remarkable development some are reading is more evidence that Putin is not inclined to stop fighting. Putin visited Kursk for the first time yesterday since Ukraine invaded last August, telling troops there at a command post while dressed in military fatigues, "I am counting on the fact that all the combat tasks facing our units will be fulfilled and the territory of Kursk will be completely liberated from the enemy." As we reported on Wednesday, it is believed that Kyiv's military operation has entered its final stage, though they have not retreated yet. The commander of Ukraine's forces, Syrsky, has vowed to hold on to territory it holds there for as long as necessary, though his troops are reportedly close to being encircled. Military analysts argue that Moscow forces have cut off the few supply routes available to the Ukrainians, with just one main road into Sudza, that key settlement they control. It was another night of extensive bombardments on Ukraine by Russia, with over 100 UAVs, 74 of which were allegedly shot down and 38 fell harmlessly. In Dnipropetrovsk, a wave of attack drones struck, damaging high-rise buildings in Dnipro. A ballistic missile hit Sumy, destroying a school in the village of Hotin. In Donetsk, Russian assaults over the past 24 hours left 3 people dead and 14 injured, with more than 200 homes damaged. Kostyantynivka suffered 21 strikes, including 18 bombs, resulting in 8 wounded and 2 more individuals trapped under the rubble. Among the injured are 2 children. An obvious point, but as we saw in Kharkiv when we visited a few months ago, one explosion can destroy hundreds of windows, turning glass into shrapnel. A single missile is extremely destructive, even if it doesn't hit a building. I think that sometimes tends to be forgotten in some coverage. But I digress. Ukrainian intelligence claims it hit a covert drone manufacturing and assembly plant in Kaluga region last night. Locals there report explosions and filmed flames enveloping what was believed to be a concrete plant in Abpuhova. In terms of ground warfare, just wrapping up, all eyes remain on Kursk, of course, although there are reports of heavy fighting in Kremlin. Yet another video has surfaced online showing the reported execution of Ukrainian prisoners of war with their hands tied behind their backs by Russian soldiers. There has been an uptick recently in such footage being circulated, and we'll wait to see if The Hague releases any statements or comments on the latest war crime footage. Europe, of course, is the other crucial theatre of the moment, where in Paris yesterday we saw that major gathering of defence officials. Dom was there, so we'll get the full Dom download immediately. That would make a good podcast, wouldn't it? But just to add that the French National Assembly, the lower chamber of the parliament, has backed a resolution on seizing the billions of frozen Russian assets. Pressure is increasing across Europe for that step to be taken. But still, within the EU, we see opposite manoeuvres, with Hungary threatening to cancel sanctions on 2,000 Russians unless the EU exempts Mikhail Fridman. It raises the question, once again, whether the EU as a body can act decisively while Russia-friendly Hungary has voting rights. Another long-standing question hanging in the air is whether more European countries need to acquire their own nuclear deterrent. Polish President Duda, in an interview with the Financial Times, has called on the US to transfer nuclear weapons to Polish territory to deter Russia. He said, "I think not only that the time has come, but that it would be safer if those weapons were already here." Just speaks to the transformation of mentality, perhaps irreversible, taking place in Europe. Now that leads me, of course, neatly onto Dom, who is back in London after his Parisian odyssey. Dom, assuming you're not too bloated on frog's legs and existentialism, what was the mood at the summit in France? Is Ukraine any closer to getting the security guarantees it so desperately wants?
Well, bonjour, Francis. So, to give it its correct title, I was at the Paris Defence and Strategy Forum, the third meeting of the E5. So the E5 being the five biggest defence powers in Europe. That's France, Germany, Britain, Poland and Italy. The defence ministers were there. So, security guarantees. What does the coalition of the willing look like? Where is the E5 in relation to the US? All these things were being discussed around two main meetings. One specifically on the support to Ukraine and secondly on wider European security architecture. Now, on the security guarantees, I got the very strong impression that the mineral deal, if and when it's ever signed, will not be on its own enough to satisfy Ukraine's need for security guarantees, and something much more substantial from the US, Europe, or probably both, is going to be required. An official close to the progress told me that the model they were looking at, the E5, was boots on the ground in country, not some sort of over-the-horizon tripwire initiated force, possibly in Romania, Poland, elsewhere. So they're very much thinking in sort of hard military terms, heavy metal terms, forward in the country. Now, Russia's view currently is that any troop presence from a NATO country is a red line for them. The official I spoke to dismissed that, saying Putin can't take a negotiating position if he's refusing to negotiate. So quite a hard line at the moment. But the process of diplomatic coordination and the consequent military planning is clearly speeding up. There's going to be another meeting, not of the E5, but just of European leaders this Saturday in London, hosted by Prime Minister Keir Starmer. The E5 group, well, it was said to me, and this was it came through loud and clear in the press conference, they're refusing to keep moving at the pace of the slowest or the least committed wider European nation. The official I spoke to was saying to me that at some point, if there's some sticking point about a particular kind of capability or readiness or posture, at some point the E5 is going to say, we hear you, we recognise your concern, but we are doing it and we're moving on. So someone is going to have to put on the big boy pants and just say we are moving forward. Now, as for the event itself, the process, whole E5 thing, is jointly chaired by France and Britain. But as we were in France, it was Sébastien Lecornu, France's defence minister, who took the lead. It's the third such meeting of the E5, and Ukraine's deputy defence minister dialed in by video link. There were 15 countries represented, and it followed a meeting also in Paris on Tuesday of 34 armed forces heads. So the military side sat on Tuesday, 34 military, the chiefs of defence staff, that level, to sort of do a show and tell about who had what. And then that was then used the next day, Wednesday, to inform the political pace of things. Now, in a tweet last night, I said Mr. Lecornu, it's the first time I've ever kind of met him face to face, but I said he looked like an angry Tom Hollander with eyebrows that could blockade the Black Sea port, but I think that was a little unfair. I have checked, and Tom Hollander is 19 years older. But anyway, Mr. Lecornu, he was leading things. He said, we don't want another Yalta with zones of influence or a repeat of Minsk 1 and 2, ceasefires without guarantees. He said the whole European continent is at stake. Now, as well as any coalition of the willing on the ground, Mr. Lecornu said that they also discussed security in the Black Sea and specifically the security of Ukraine's nuclear power plants in any post-ceasefire arrangement. He took issue with, and interesting, was backed up by Boris Pistorius, who's Germany's defence minister. Mr. Lecornu took issue with over the dependence, his word, dependence on Starlink. He said Europe needs to develop its own capability in that regard. You'll remember last week's spat between Poland's foreign minister and Elon Musk over Starlink, with a little bit of afters from Marco Rubio. Anyway, then Italy's Guido Crosetto, their defence minister, he said some countries, including mine, have hidden behind the US umbrella, but he said that Donald Trump was a brutal awakening for the international community. And then talking about this awakening theme, Poland's Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz, their defence minister, he said the giant, as in Europe, the giant is awakening. Our civilization is under threat. It was all rounded off. The press conference was rounded off with John Healey, Britain's defence secretary, saying, I say to Putin, over to you. You said you want to talk, prove it. And that was just echoing a line that Boris Pistorius had said earlier, saying it's up to Putin to make himself available, as he always said he was. So not a huge amount out of the press conference. It was a united front, all that kind of stuff, as you'd expect. But we then had a huddle, the very small number of British journalists represented there. We had a side huddle with John Healey, the Defence Secretary, where he was asked specifically about that issue of Western boots on the ground being a red line, or whether any accommodation should be given to Russia's position on that. John Healey said,
Well, first of all, Putin isn't even negotiating yet. So he's in no position to lay down red lines on that. The negotiations haven't started. The jury's still out about whether he's serious. And that's why I said today, look, the pressure is on Putin. And the task for President Trump is to bring Putin to the negotiation table, as he said he would, because that's the only way we're going to secure peace. And we are all throwing our weight behind this opportunity that only President Trump could have created. And yesterday was a really important step in that push for peace. We're doing our bit. We're doing our bit to prepare the European leadership, potentially involving a number of nations beyond Europe, to continue to stand with Ukraine after a ceasefire, just like we have 3 years during the fight.
Is the new security construct, is that still dependent on some kind of backstop from the US? Is the minerals deal, which is back on, is that a sufficient backstop, or is it insufficient?
So the one message from today and yesterday is that the momentum is building behind the coalition of the willing. You saw yesterday the military chiefs of 34 nations here in Paris, a wide willingness to participate in those discussions. You'll see we're accelerating that work from today. So on Saturday you'll see the Prime Minister host another Leaders Summit. I confirmed today that next week military-to-military discussions in the UK will continue on some of the detail of the options and operations. And the expectation has always been that we lead from Europe, we involve others, and we want the US to play a part involved in the reassurance force and the backstop that helps reinforce the deterrent to Putin against reinvading. But ultimately, the best guarantee of Ukraine's future security is a stronger armed forces, and the best deterrent against Putin simply reinvading is a stronger, more independent Ukraine.
Just very quickly, is the minerals deal a sufficient backstop or not?
The minerals deal is a step towards a process where we get a ceasefire, we hope a negotiated peace, reinforced by support from nations like ours, led by France and the UK, just as we have done during this period of conflict, through a period beyond the ceasefire and peace.
Right. So he did not answer it directly about the minerals deal. That is absolutely clear. He did not answer it. But given he was asked outright a number of times, I took that to be a pretty clear indication that the minerals deal alone is not going to be seen as providing sufficient security guarantees. Now, overall, I don't think it was a bad summit. I don't think we expected the press conference to be a list of how many troops were coming from which country and where the jets are going to be based and all that kind of stuff. There were no clear answers in Paris, I think because things are moving so fast and specifics are hard to nail down. There were lots of generalizations and what we used to call in the military sort of big hand, small map type of chats. They were vague. I wouldn't say waffly, that would be unfair, but they were just very thematic, broad brush, overarching principles, that kind of talk. Now, the E5, they are obviously working in a pretty fevered atmosphere. They've got one eye at the US process and on Donald Trump specifically. And I got the very strong impression through their chat and sidebar conversations that they are looking for any post-ceasefire activity by Western militaries in Ukraine to effectively be an extension of the support that's already being given. So training, weapon supplies, humanitarian support, not a completely separate type of operation coming from different troops, etc., etc. Now, I would imagine there will be an early and concerted effort to clear the Black Sea of mines post any, if not the 30-day ceasefire period, then any sort of extended period of actual peace negotiation. Get the Black Sea going so trade can get going once again. And Ukraine will want its airspace safely reopened to commercial traffic. Again, also for trade, but also it's a powerful sign of normality. But the big question that was still lingering at the end of yesterday was who, in this constantly evolving E5 process, decides to press print on the design of any coalition of the willing, under what circumstances will that happen, and what will be enough to tie in US capabilities. So as many questions as answers, Francis. One thing that was very clear was that this is not going to be a peacekeeping force. That term was absolutely rejected. It's not a border separation force and not a tripwire force, anything of that ilk that we've seen in other places like the Balkans. This is something else, much more akin, I think, and as I said earlier, to just a continuation of support that's already been given, albeit from outside the country, that will now continue inside. So what's that going to be called? A reassurance force or just the coalition of the willing, coalition troops? Who knows? But Sebastian Lecornu, he said when asked about a peacekeeping force, we're not going to be there to observe or to deconflict. So he was implying a much sharper-edged force than we have seen in other recent post-conflict situations. So no great answers, Francis. Still many questions, but a very united front. Good. I hope there's more answers behind closed doors. Interesting that we went from 34 defence chiefs on Tuesday, as in military defence chiefs, to 15 countries on Wednesday looking to be part of this coalition of the willing. You might want to ask, well, what happened to all the others? Were they not keen, or quite what's going on there? So a lot happening that we are not privy to, but the process moves on. Next thing, Saturday, Keir Starmer with a leaders' summit here in London.
Well, thanks very much, Dom, for that dispatch, as it were, from Paris. Delighted to welcome back to the podcast now Professor Phillips O'Brien, Professor of Strategic Studies at St Andrews. Phillips, welcome. Shall we start with Europe's response before we come to the ceasefire discussion? What's your assessment of where Europe is at the moment? Do you think that they're doing enough? Do you think that they realise the seriousness of the precariousness of the moment, or are you still sceptical as to the actions that are actually being taken at the moment?
It's divided, Francis. There are some European states, the Finns, the Baltics, who clearly understand what is at stake here. There are still states, however, that seem to think that they can work with Trump. And even little things like this 30-day ceasefire proposal seems to give some of those people hope. And so I would say the more people that have hope, the worse. And that I would rather extinguish all hope in Europe and say, this is up to Europe. This is their time. Either they can face it honestly, European states, and try and help Ukraine and work with Ukraine, or really it's just not going to work.
Yes, it does seem that that there is a lot of division, as you say, at the moment, and no doubt there's a lot of high-octane conversations taking place behind closed doors. Where do you stand, Phil, on the discussion then around ceasefire? Do you think that Putin will be inclined to reject it, as appears the case at the time of our recording? And if he does, I see that in your newsletter today, you say that it is clearer that we are seeing a part of a process. And as always, it is a process that seems to be favouring Russia with regards to the conversation coming out of the United States.
Ukraine's partners, and I don't know if the USA should be included in that now, have basically been such bad negotiators. We've assumed really bad negotiating is the norm, because most of the negotiating by Ukraine partners has been, what does Ukraine have to give up? And what can we pressure them to give up? And will Ukraine agree ahead of time to give up some territory or agree to give up this? The Russians are being actually smart negotiators. They're saying, no, we don't want this. If we're going to want this, we're going to have major concessions. And it just seems we unconsciously built that into the way we report these things, which gives the Russians an enormous advantage. So everyone says, Trump gave more aid to Ukraine. Well, he didn't. He just turned on the spigot that he had turned off 2 weeks ago, which, by the way, is just Biden administration leftover aid. There is no new U.S. aid that has been approved. All right, so what he did was simply go back to where the U.S. was 2 weeks ago with some aid that's there to be delivered that had been stockpiled. But it's not like this is a great new deal for Ukraine or a lot of extra support for Ukraine. It's weeks of damage to Ukraine, which they've gone back to an earlier period. But what Russia's going to do is come up with a list of new concessions that they expect if they're going to get the ceasefire. So Ukraine gets basically a return in time for the ceasefire. What do the Russians get? Well, they might ask for sanctions relief, as you said. They might ask for Ukraine not to receive any more military aid, or certainly severely reduced military aid. They might even ask for the number one thing. They want to get Zelensky out, and they want new Ukrainian elections. So they might demand that. So it's weird that we look at the Russians just doing what a state would normally do to negotiate for itself and act like this is somehow amazing. It's more that we have been such bad supporters of Ukraine, and the Trump administration in particular, by basically handing over parts of Ukraine to Russia already, that we get surprised when a state does it properly.
Let's just talk a little bit, if I may, about Kursk, because it is one of the big subjects of the moment. Yep. What's your assessment strategically, militarily, of the chances of, to Sersky's point, them holding on there? Do you think it's all over, as it were? And then I'd be interested in your assessment, Phil, on the whole operation. Do you think it has been worth the cost, as it were?
Well, I think what happened, the Russians were threatening the supply lines for a while. A lot of it was being done with UAVs. And the Ukrainians have found it increasingly difficult to get supplies in. And that has allowed the Russians to push them back by making this the main area of Russian offensive activity for a while. If the Ukrainians choose to pull out, I hope it's because of the right reason, which is they have decided that holding it will lead to too many losses for them compared to the losses they feel they can extract from the Russians. Certainly holding parts of Russian territory is very valuable, which is why you can see Putin going to extreme lengths to get it back. That if Ukraine can hold any bit of Russia, that gives them some leverage negotiation. So it's a tricky one. I don't think the Ukrainians should take massive losses or significant losses to hold it, but if they can hold it, they should. They might try to hold a much smaller pocket, literally just a few miles over the border, to give them some kind of leverage, but they've retreated back to Sudzha, and it looks like they might be going back even closer to the border. In the long run, I think, yes, this was definitely worth the effort from Ukraine. Remember, they've had this now since August. The Russians have had to exert enormous force to try and take it back. Russian losses have been extremely high in doing that. And what's interesting in the last few months is the Russians have been concentrating so much on Kursk. Their offensive in the other parts of the fronts have basically dwindled. So they've made hardly any advances at all in parts of the Donbass. In fact, in the last few weeks, the Ukrainians have retaken little chunks of that. So it seems to me that had you in August, when this started, said, oh, yes, in mid-March of 2025, Ukraine will still hold Pokrovsk, still hold most of Chasiv Yar, still hold most of these towns that were being fought over, you would say, great, that's a really good result. And so actually, if you look at from last August to now, the Ukrainians have done a pretty good job.
Interesting. Well, it'll certainly be one of the most debated operations, I think, of the entire war when it ends. Moving subjects again, if I may, and I know Dom will be champing at the bit to ask questions as well. What, in your view, is the minimal agreement? I hesitate to use the term peace deal because I think that for all of the reasons that we've talked about in previous episodes, that term is very problematic because many of the elements of peace that are being talked about are actually major concessions for the Ukrainians. Some could even describe it as aspects of surrender of sovereignty deal, if it would be more accurate. But let's just use the term because it's popular at the moment. If we were to see a peace deal that was struck, what is the minimum that Europe could permit, you think, that would guarantee its own security? Do there need to be troops on the ground, in your view, or is there a version of this term we see, porcupine Ukraine, a Ukraine that's armed to the teeth, that you think would be enough of a deterrent? Or do you think there does, in essence, need to be an air shield or European troops on the ground?
I don't see how you can have any security guarantees that Ukraine would take seriously without European forces in Ukraine. They had the world's greatest security guarantees after 1991. They had the United States guarantee it by treaty. They had the Russians guaranteed it by treaty. They had security guarantees that looked amazing. But there were no troops there to protect them, and then those security guarantees were shown to be worthless. So what can Europe do? On the assumption that the U.S. is probably out of the game, which I think is a very serious possibility and needs to be the basis of European planning, they have to have Ukraine, one, with some European forces in it, and those are combat forces, with air assets close enough that they could be quickly used to defend Ukraine. They need to have Ukraine with accelerated membership of the European Union. I think that needs to be done. And crucially, as Zelensky said yesterday, Ukraine cannot be pressured to give up its legal right to the occupied territories. Now, it's going to be, under any deal, it's going to be hard to get the Russians to pull out of it. But as long as Ukraine can retain the legal right, the legal statement that these parts are Ukraine, then that gives them something to sort of fall back on going future. So Europe alone with Ukraine, yes, requires troops, yes, requires accelerated EU membership, and yes, requires a clear statement that Ukraine is not legally ceding its own territory.
Phillips, hi, Dom here. Delighted to have you back. Thanks so much for joining us today. My first question was going to be that sort of, what do you think about boots on the ground versus this kind of over-the-horizon force? Because I just wonder, without an Article 5, basically, is this not a Srebrenica movement? So let's say you've got a Western brigade in Dnipro and Kharkiv and what have you, doing training and all that kind of good stuff. Russia pushes the line, invades, shoves some troops over, little green men or otherwise. If that Western force then doesn't pile out of the barracks and go and fight them, is that not a Srebrenica moment where the West just sort of caves again?
Very much the way we're approaching NATO and the Baltics now. That, the Baltics say we need combat forces in our countries, or we're really not going to take Article 5 as seriously as you think. And that would be Ukraine's position as well. If these troops are not there to fight, and to make that very clear, then really we're not going to feel defended, and nor should the Ukrainians feel defended. I mean, why would they take any over-the-horizon pledges at all at face value? Because one, they're being made by governments that could change. These governments could be corrupted as Hungary and Slovakia are now. So that, I mean, it's going to require, I think people are just living a bit pie in the sky about, we can come up with all these fancy ways of providing security. Ukraine had all the fancy ways before, and they were absolutely meaningless It's going to require Ukraine to be a full European state with full European security guarantees from the other European states and a military that's integrated with other European militaries, say the way that European militaries have integrated with NATO. And I don't see anything else as at all going to deter Russia in the future, or to make the Ukrainians, by the way, trust Europe. I mean, the thing that people aren't calculating in is if the Ukrainians feel abandoned, maybe they go a different direction, which would be very scary. That we treat the Ukrainians almost as if they're good little puppies who will do what we want and take whatever scraps we offer them off the table. This is a nation that has suffered hugely and has been fighting for its own independence and freedom. And I think it deserves a little bit more than we're offering it.
So we keep saying European in this, but how or what does the coalition of the willing have to look like to have the best chance of success? Is it important to have non-NATO countries, non-European countries, for example, from, I don't know, Australia or South Asia? How important is that?
I understand the Polish argument. They share a border with Russia, so they should have their troops on their border with Russia and Belarus. But all the other big powers that don't share a border with Russia and Belarus should have troops in Ukraine. That's the British, the French, the Germans, I would say the Italians. They would be perhaps the most reluctant. But really, if this is an existential European threat, if the fate of Ukraine is absolutely vital to the future of Europe, freedom and liberty on the European continent, then every European state that is not already on the border with Russia and Belarus should have some obligation to provide security to Ukraine. Otherwise, they're just talking out of their whatever. So either this does matter, and it really matters, as I believe, in which case all European states should be willing to step up, or really it's just a bunch of political game playing.
Indeed. And the last one for me for now, if I may, just a little bit wider. How concerned are you that matters pertaining to nuclear weapons are increasingly being discussed? And we know Russia likes to rattle the nuclear saber a lot and talk about it and all that kind of stuff, but it's not really been in the Western military or political culture to talk about nuclear weapons. We don't want to normalize them. But now we've got comments from Macron, we've got Friedrich Merz talking about them. Is this damaging to useful ambiguity? Is it helpful that we're talking about these, or dangerous that we seem to be normalizing the chat about nuclear weapons?
We got to talk about it more. I mean, if you actually believe the U.S. nuclear umbrella still hangs over Europe, you're far more of an optimist than I am. I do not believe that Donald Trump would ever use nuclear weapons to defend Europe against Russia. I think you should plan now on the assumption that there is no U.S. nuclear umbrella, certainly not one that would ever be employed if Russia threatened Europe with nuclear weapons. So I think we have to normalize the discussion of nuclear weapons. I mean, I wrote about this, I think, well over a year ago, where I said Europe has to plan for its own nuclear deterrent somehow, and that's a real nuclear deterrent. And it will have to invest on the technologies of delivery systems as well as the warheads, and probably have a variety of systems to provide some deterrent effect. I mean, what the war in Ukraine has shown is that having nuclear weapons is a massive strategic advantage and provides security in and of itself. Why was the Biden administration so paranoid about any attacks onto Russia? It's because Russia's a nuclear power, and they were afraid of escalation. So they severely limited the aid given to Ukraine. If that lesson has not been learned, then really I despair about what we've seen in the last few years. So we must normalize the idea of Europe having nuclear weapons. There must be an investment in Europe having nuclear weapons, and it better happen pretty darn quick.
Okay, so in the short term then, the nuclear powers in Europe, Britain and France has not declared, i.e. offered, her nuclear arsenal to NATO. Britain has. Do you think the time is now for Britain, and whatever this coalition of the willing thing is, or maybe use the construct of the Joint Expeditionary Force or whatever, but do you think Britain should be more upfront about how and when, in this kind of scenario, she would extend her nuclear umbrella?
I do think the British nuclear deterrent has to be extended to European states now who want it. So it can't be on the assumption that all NATO allies cannot trust the United States anymore to provide it. You can't force it on a country. If the Hungarians don't want it, they don't want it. But if a European state that's in NATO now feels that it is not covered by the US and would like guarantees by the French and the British until a European nuclear deterrent of some kind is constructed, then I think it behooves the British to stand up for these European states and offer it to them. I mean, this is their moment. I mean, either we're serious about what we've been talking about the last few decades, or it's all a bit of a sham. And this is the time when we're going to find out.
Phil, just since we're on the subject of the British nuclear deterrent, it has been put forward by some, including Dominic Cummings, former Chief of Staff at Downing Street under Boris Johnson, that we don't have an independent nuclear deterrent, that in essence there is an off switch in the United States, or that we're severely restricted in our usage, and that if Washington said no, that we would be on our own. Is that true?
Well, I think it's true. I mean, look, right now, the submarine that's out to sea, if the British government wanted to press the button, they could press the button. The issue is the U.S. has been vital for everything about upgrading and maintenance, new systems, and all of that. And so what it means is if you're going to continue with the present nuclear deterrent without U.S. support, it's hard to see how it functions. So I think the U.S. has been so central to the deterrent that the UK has, that it simply, you can't just simply keep upgrading it without the US. It will lose its utility. By the way, this is the issue being faced with a lot of other weapon systems. It's all of a sudden become clear that in buying all these US weapons, it was a political choice as well as an economic and military choice. And the political choice was that the United States would always back you. Because the U.S. now, if it stops doing software updates on F-35s, what the heck happens to those aircraft? If it stops doing, it can do what it did for the Ukrainians with HIMARS, turn off the targeting, the intelligence targeting at night, and they won't be used. So Europe has to look at its whole range of systems and go for really internal resilience so that they can function them without the U.S., because I don't think they can count on the U.S. being their friend.
And of course, this has implications beyond Europe because of AUKUS. I mean, AUKUS's first pillar was this nuclear submarine independent deterrence bit. I mean, do you think that the AUKUS deal is dead? It does seem that Britain in particular has gone very quiet about it.
It's really expensive. So it's far more expensive than the French one. Again, it was partly a political move by the Australians as well. I think feeling that it was a way of getting the U.S. on side and providing greater security. But if the U.S. is showing itself to be such an unreliable ally and the cost is so large, and who knows what Trump will or won't do, if Australia wishes to reconsider that, I wouldn't be surprised. I would think anyone who based their future on a consistent amount of support from the U.S. and the U.S. being a reliable partner to fight with them and for them should be reconsidering that to its core, because that is no longer the case.
To its core, then, is NATO dead, Phil? Is Article 5 no more?
I would say it is now de facto dead, but not de jure dead. De facto in that the U.S. would I cannot believe the U.S. would fight the Russians for Europe. So if the Russians threatened the Baltics, I can't imagine the U.S. would send forces in at that point. So my view, it is de facto dead while being not de jure dead. It would almost be better if it was de jure dead, because then people wouldn't continually have hope that it will come back and be resuscitated. And the question is, even if you have an Atlanticist president in 4 years or 8 years' time, do you trust that? That what we see, the reality is that there has an allowance by Europe to outsource its strategic thinking and strategic capabilities to the United States has put them in a profoundly uncomfortable situation. What they've been saved so far by the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians have done such damage to the Russian military that right now the Russian military cannot threaten Europe. So thankfully, Ukraine has provided a breathing space of some kind for Europe to adjust to this new reality. They better adjust really darn quickly.
Well, this brings me on to a broader question then about the institutions that we have, whether it be NATO or the EU. I spoke earlier on about the problems within the EU because Hungary is in there and that limits the EU's ability to act decisively. Do you think that the bodies we have for, if we call it in rather blunt terms, fighting Russia, are insufficient or limited in their scope now, given the actions of the last 3 years? Do you think we need new ones? I mean, how much can we rely on the old bodies, or do you think actually we need to, in a sense, rip up and start again?
So you're going to have to deal now with either putting such pressure on Hungary and Slovakia that they allow the EU to function in this element, or if they don't, in the short term, you just have to go with coalitions of the willing. So that's your immediate option. But going forward, you're going to need a new structure. By the way, also without the US. So you're going to need some kind of European NATO that will provide the kind of key structural impetus to what we're seeing, but that can't be made up overnight. So I think the structure now is inadequate. Quite clearly, it's inadequate, partly because European states really never thought they would get in this situation, but they are in this situation. They will have to make the best of it. I mean, I think you were talking about earlier in your report, the Big Five, is probably a pretty good basis about which to start that organization, assuming they're all trustworthy, and so far they have been. And you'll have to build on that for now, but the present structure cannot endure.
And one has to wonder whether what these new bodies would take would be far more rooted in the core values, the core principles of those defendants. I mean, I remember in the first year of the war talking about whether Turkey should be a member of NATO, given some of its actions. I mean, where do you stand on Turkey? Do you think they need to be part of the European security architecture, or do you see them as an unreliable partner, as it were? They've said some quite punchy things in the last few weeks that would be seen as being pro-Ukrainian, but then throughout the course of the war, they've also been some of the first to, as it were, be extending a hand to the Russians, as is their, in essence, traditional role in European affairs.
Well, I think what we have to realize is, what is the big dividing line now? It's not just strategic worth or not. It's states and societies that believe in, I will call, liberal democracy and freedom versus populist authoritarianism. So the states that have to make up the new European structure have to pledge to be, in some ways, liberal democracies, and not to go down a route that we have seen in the Viktor Orbáns. And therefore, ask yourself about Turkey. Where does it fit in that? That if Turkey is a stalking horse for political authoritarianism in a new European defense structure, I don't want it. On the other hand, if a new European defense structure can be a way to, you might say, encourage Turkey to go down a different road, then it has possibilities. But what we can't have in the new structure are the Viktor Orbáns and the Robert Ficos, because that's the way Putin will try to corrupt it. I mean, clearly what Putin has learned is that you can corrupt institutions from the inside much more easily than conquer them from the outside. He has been wildly successful in that, and he now even has in many ways corrupted the US from the inside. So that organization has to first and foremost look after itself politically.
Dom, can I go to you for your final thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. I mean, it kind of continues the theme we've just been discussing there. So I'm looking around at the moment. I see the G7 meeting in Canada right now. You've got the EU doing its thing. You've got this E5 that I was at. You know, these bodies are mostly, certainly not all, but mostly aligned on one of, if not the biggest issue in decades. So if they can't come to a common position politically, financially and militarily, let alone whether or not they get their way, I think that's going to speak volumes about the power right now of democracy. Democracy is right in the spotlight. Democracy is so far it's been a 400-year experiment. It has no divine right to exist. And I think there's real challenges right now from autocracies or this, the strong man model of human organization, this idea that might is right. I think if something substantial doesn't come out of this whole period of history, like I say, if they don't get their own way, fine. But if they don't come to a common position, I think there'll be a lot of questions from a lot of people saying, well, why do we have all these bodies then? What is democracy if it can't even come to a position on the biggest issue for decades? So I think democracy is right in the spotlight right now.
Phil, what are your final thoughts?
My final thoughts is I really wish people would give up hope about the U.S. and Trump right now. I mean, maybe he will surprise everyone and end up being more pro-NATO and more pro-Ukraine than he seems to be. But I think that's also a dangerous hope to have, because I think that will delay taking the crucial steps that need to be taken. So I would say the key thing is to give up hope and plan for the future. based not on the US.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.